Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Mark Hoff, and I'll be moderating today. Abradin ao Vivo Linguists Online is an initiative of the Brazilian Linguistics Association and is designed to give students and researchers free access to state-of-the-art discussions on the most diverse topics related to the study of human language. Today, I have the immense pleasure of introducing Dr. Patrícia Amaral, an associate professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at Indiana University. Dr. Amaral is a leading scholar in both semantics and pragmatics and has published widely on topics as diverse as scalar adverbs, experimental approaches to presupposition, situations of Portuguese language contact, and diachronic change across Ibero-Romance. Her most recent work can be found in prestigious journals such as Linguistics, Linguistics and Philosophy, and Journal of Historical Pragmatics, to name just a few, as well as in several edited volumes and monographs. Dr. Amaral's talk is entitled What Adverbs Undo? A Romance Perspective. And before she begins, I would like to thank her once more for sharing this exciting research with us today. As a final reminder, questions can be asked in the chat throughout the talk, and we will have a moderated Q&A session at the end. So without further ado, I'll give the floor to Dr. Amaral.
All right, so thank you very much to Abralim for this invitation, and thank you, Mark, for making the time to do this. So I'm going to share the screen to my talk. Okay. All right. Sorry, there's a little problem with the, okay. So just a second, because I'm having trouble here with the share screen. Mark, can you just tell me if you're seeing?
Yes, I'm able to see it. Yeah.
You're seeing it? Okay, because when I switched to full screen mode, I couldn't move. Okay, now it's working, right? Okay. All right. So I would like to start with a sentence from a Portuguese grammarian from the 16th century, João de Barros, who wrote this about adverbs. The adverb has this power. It reduces and totally destroys the work of the verb it occurs with. And I chose this sentence because it's particularly relevant, I think, for the classes of adverbs that I will talk about today. And why adverbs? Well, adverbs have proven challenging for linguistic theories, and this has been pointed out in several studies that look at adverbs at the syntax-semantics interface. The definition in dealing with adverbs has to do with their categorical status, and there's a wide range of issues that they raise to analysis of specific classes of adverbs that have proven challenging. And something that has been pointed out by several authors is that a proper characterization of their function as modifiers is not straightforward because they're quite flexible in terms of syntactic position. In addition, adverbs frequently interact with other aspects of the meaning of a sentence, like focus presupposition structure. And so this makes it hard to define in many cases what exactly they modify, and makes it hard to provide systematic accounts of their behavior. So today, I'm going to focus in particular in issues at the syntax, at the semantics pragmatics interface. And I would like to focus on two classes of adverbs that have been less studied in order to broaden the empirical coverage of the study of adverbs. And in particular, because these classes I'll be focusing on have patterns of interpretation that I believe are revealing in terms of types of meaning and their dependence on context. So I will focus on approximative adverbs. So this is a term, approximative, a term that was coined by Horn he initially focused on adverbs like almost, barely, and hardly in English. And also another class, adverbs of truth, persistence, and unpersistence, a term that was coined in work by me and Fabio Del Prete. And for the first class, I will discuss mostly examples from European Portuguese quasi, as well as some examples of its counterparts in other Romance languages. I will not discuss in detail the meaning of mal in Portuguese or barely, hardly, although I will mention briefly one study in which I analyzed both. And then for adverbs of truth and persistence, I will focus on EP, afinal, as well as some cross-linguistic counterparts, for example, in Italian, alla fine. All right, so let's start with two examples, one of each of these classes. So in one, a Joana chegou a casa quase às 3 da tarde. Intuitively, we see that the contribution of quasi to this sentence is that Joana arrived home at a time which was not 3 p.m., but rather before and closely before 3 p.m. So this could be 2:58 or 2:59, for example, right? So we can think about the meaning of this sentence as involving multiple components, right? Having to do with this element, às 3 da tarde, that intuitively is being modified by quasi, which is adjacent to it. As for two, afinal, os Jogos Olímpicos de 2016 vão ser em São Paulo. Again, we can think of the interpretation of the sentence in terms of several components. On the one hand, we know that the sentence asserts that the Olympic Games of 2016 will be in São Paulo. And in addition, there is an implication that this proposition is incompatible with some previous belief about where the Olympic Games would be, right? So we have, again, multiple meaning components that are contributed by this adverb. And of course, in both cases, we could easily remove the adverbs and the sentences would be fine, right? So starting with approximative adverbs, in this talk, I'm going to be particularly interested in one of the components of quasi that I will call the polar component following Horn and many others. And what is this component of meaning? Well, I will say that a sentence of type quasi s entails a negation, but of course this negation is focus sensitive. So it does not deny the truth of the entire sentence that quasi combines with, which I'll be calling the prejacent. So the prejacent is the minimal sentence in which quasi occurs. So it's the proposition we obtain by taking quasi out of the sentence. So as I was saying, that negation is focus sensitive because it denies the truth of the prejacent for the particular value of the focused constituent, right? So in this case, what this means is that Joana arrived home at a time which is not 3 p.m., right? And of course, this is important because this component crucially changes the truth conditions of the sentence, right? And what you're seeing in the lower corner is an ad of a travel agency from some years ago in Italy that was called Vola Quasi Gratis, right? And of course, if you just see the big letters, right? So fly for free, you're going to be misled, of course, right? Because the introduction of quasi here, modifying gratis, crucially changes the meaning. So you don't fly for free, you fly for a low cost, right? As for the second class of adverbs is with afinal. In this example that we saw before, we know that the sentence entails that the Olympic Games of 2016 will be in São Paulo. And then the use of afinal introduces a presupposition, namely that a proposition incompatible with a prejacent was previously assumed to be true, and this was shared knowledge by the interlocutors. So thinking about what we know about the real world, in fact, the 2016 Olympics will take place in Rio, right? So this was the previously assumed proposition. Okay, so what's interesting about these components that I mentioned is that they are part of the conventional meaning of these adverbs. So they don't easily go away. And as we see in 5, if I utter the sentence I mentioned before, a Joana chegou a casa quase às 3 da tarde, and then I want to undo this effect of quasi, right? What I obtain is a contradictory sentence. So I cannot then say that she arrived, in fact, at 3 p.m. And by the same token, if I use the family of sentences test with a sentence with a finale, so if I create an interrogative sentence, or if I put the sentence under the scope of negation, or on an antecedent of a conditional, the main entailment, so the meaning that the Olympic Games will be in Sao Paulo, goes away, but the other component, the presupposed meaning of this incompatible proposition, doesn't go away. So it actually survives in these 3 contexts. So what that tells me is that these 2 meaning components, although they somehow seem secondary in the sense that I will discuss later, they actually survive, and they're part of the conventional meaning of these adverbs. So this shows us that the meaning of these adverbs is multidimensional, so it has several components with different properties, and both in the polar component or polar implication of approximatives and the implication of truth and persistence are part of the conventional meaning of the semantics of these adverbs. Okay, so here are some of the questions I will address today. First of all, why am I selecting these 2 classes? So what do approximatives and adverbs of truth and persistence have in common? What are the meaning components that they contribute? And finally, what do their properties reveal about lexical meaning, in particular with respect to context sensitivity? And here's an overview of the talk. I will first focus on approximatives and the 2 component analysis that I have proposed in my work. Then I'll focus on the relevant notion of scale, and then move to some of the puzzling properties of approximatives that make them interesting. First of all, the asymmetry of the 2 meaning components they display. And I will talk about, in particular, the relation between scales and expectations. Then I'll move to truth persistence and truth unpersistence, so the second class of adverbs. I'll discuss some of the constraints on their use, and then the 2 types of epistemic attitudes they're associated with, expectations and beliefs. And finally discuss the relation between scales and context sensitivity, which I will argue is precisely what they both have in common, these 2 classes of adverbs. Both involve a scalar representation, and that underlies their context sensitivity. Okay, so starting with approximatives, and in particular the meaning of quasi and its cross-linguistic Romance counterparts, I will claim that these adverbs associate with focus, and more specifically that they're focus functional, and I'll explain in a second what I mean by this. I will also claim that they require that a scale, a linear order, be accessible, and they're sensitive to the direction of the scale, and that scalarity is crucially related to their context dependence. So starting with this idea of focus sensitivity, and here I will be giving some examples from quasi, taken from my paper with Fabio Del Prete from 2010. When we look at sentences containing quasi, we see that there are truth conditional effects of focus placement. And in the case of Italian, the same is true for Portuguese. Focus is marked by prosodic prominence and syntactic adjacency. Okay. So in the 2 sentences 9 and 10, we can see that the sentences have different truth conditions precisely because of focus placement. So in 9, Leo ha quasi corso fino a casa mia. The focus constituent is corso, right? So is the verb, and so what the sentence means is that Leo went up to my house by a very fast moving pace, right? Which closely approximates running, right? Whereas in the second case, in 10, quasi actually associates with the PP fino a casa mia, right? So this is the focus. And in this case, what the sentence means is that he ran up to a point which is close to my house and precedes it. So here, what we have is a spatial path, right, where the limit point is my house, okay? So of course, these sentences, they have different truth conditions because only in the first case, the sentence is true if Leo actually reached my house, right? Because of the polar component of quasi in 10, he did not reach my house. And we actually in this paper made a stronger claim. So we said that quasi is not just focus sensitive, it is a focus functional adverb, meaning that it lexically requires that its argument be focused. So this can be tested because it cannot associate with leaners, and what I mean by leaners is phonologically weak elements or traces of movement. So what we see when we test these examples is that when we have a leaner in the sentence, quasi will never display readings in which it modifies them, okay? So we can test, for example, for Italian, by showing that quasi cannot associate with clitic pronouns because they're phonologically weak, and so they cannot bear focus. So here are some examples. In 11, abbiamo parlato quasi di tutto. In this case, quasi is associating with the meaning of tutto, right? So let's imagine if we had 5 topics to talk about. This sentence is true if we talked about 4, right? Whereas in 12, quasi ne abbiamo parlato, right? Where we're replacing di tutto by a clitic pronoun, the sentence cannot have the same interpretation as 11. So in this case, what the sentence means is that we almost got to talk about it, right? But we didn't, but we don't have the same interpretation in 11. We talked about almost everything. And the same in 13, siamo andati quasi in Alaska. We went almost to Alaska, so the sentence has a reading in which we got to a point which is very close to Alaska, but we didn't reach it. Whereas in 14, quasi ci siamo andati, where we're replacing in Alaska by a clitic pronoun. Again, the sentence does not have the interpretation in 13, but rather it means we almost went there. So for example, we got very close to starting the trip, but eventually didn't do it, okay? So this shows us that quasi is focus functional in the sense that it requires an argument that can bear focus. So taking this as a main assumption in the 2-component analysis proposed, what we're going to do is use precisely the semantic value of the focused constituent, which is represented here in red, to combine compositionally with the meaning of quasi. And like we said before, so one of the components is the negation of the truth of the prejacent for the particular value of the focused constituent. So we're negating the sentence for the truth at 3 p.m. So this means that Joanna arrived at a time which is not 3 p.m. And then we also have an implication of closeness to the value of this focused constituent at time close to 3, and because of the scalar implication, arrived at a time that is before 3 p.m. So in a slightly more formal configuration, we have here the polar components of the negation of the sentence for this specific value, and then the entailment that the sentence holds, so Joana chegou, for some value which is ordered on a temporal scale before 3 p.m. and is close to 3 p.m. We are asserting that she arrived at this time point. This is what we'll call the proximal component. So in this respect, quasi and so-called approximatives are different from other words that also have to do with approximation, and sometimes people talk about these also as vague, as adverbs denoting vagueness. One example would be approximately in English, or mais ou menos in Portuguese. As we see here, these adverbs are different because although they do entail closeness, there is no implication as to whether the interpretation pertains to a value which is less or more So there is a closeness implication, but there is no polar entailment. So a Joana chegou mais ou menos às 3 could be at 3, 5, for example, and there is no scalar entailment. And this has been pointed out, for example, for Spanish by García Medal in his work. And something that is important in this comparison is that it actually helps us flesh out the scalar component of approximatives. And we can compare this by looking at 18 and 19, examples from Spanish. El Papa está casi en Roma, pero no se sabe exactamente a qué hora llegará. Seems a totally acceptable sentence, whereas 19, el Papa está más o menos en Roma, pero no se sabe exactamente a qué hora llegará, is strange. And this has to do with the fact that only in the first case, in 18, the presence of casi in the sentence invokes a scale, right, which is a spatial path ending in Rome, right? So in 18, the first conjunct conveys the information that the Pope is directed towards Rome. And of course, the most natural scale in this case is a spatial path whose limit point is Rome. But this is not available in 19 precisely because más o menos doesn't have a scalar meaning. So one of the crucial points in the interpretation of quasi and its cross-linguistic counterparts is precisely this notion of scale that can be of many different types. So here we're talking about spatial paths, but for example, if we look at temporal connectives, one being before, the relevant scale in this case is an ordered set of time points. But then the exact interpretation we obtain has to do with the meaning, with the precise meaning of the temporal connective, okay? So for example, if we talk about the temporal connective before, what we have is a time interval like we have in the representation here. So the example 20, which is an example we have in one of our papers, l'avventura olimpica di Tommaso Rocchi è finita quasi prima di cominciare. So this is talking about a player who had an accident at the very beginning of the Olympic Games, and so he basically only played 1 or 2 games. And the contribution of prima here, so before, of course, is to create this time interval that extends up to a point, which is when the adventure starts, right? And so all this interval is before the adventure starts. And in this case, the contribution of quasi is going to be closeness from the right because of the polar component, right? So his adventure started, his adventure stopped, è finita, shortly after it started, right? So in this case, the approximation is from right to left, because of the meaning of prima and the interaction with the semantics of this order on time points. So we saw that in the previous example, we were talking about a spatial path. Here, the scale is an ordered set of time points. So this shows that the range of expressions that quasi and its cross-linguistic counterparts may modify requires a broad notion of scale. Not just horn scales. It was proposed, for example, by Penka 2006. And so in our work, we propose that a scale is actual linear relation, a two-place relation that has the properties of reflexivity, antisymmetry, transitivity, and connectedness. We won't discuss this in detail, but actually for our purposes, reflexivity doesn't matter very much. Some of the relations will be reflexive, whether others will be irreflexive. But the important point to make is that we need quite a broad notion of what a scale is in order to account for the patterns of interpretation that we find with quasi. And the scale is going to be determined both by the semantics of the modified element together with contextual information. So this sensitivity to contextual information is something that has been pointed out in most studies on almost, and in a very early paper by Sedok, where he said a second area of vagueness in the use of almost has to do with the direction of the scale. Therefore, the example, it's almost 0 Celsius, can be taken in two ways, depending on whether, for example, there has just been a heat wave or a cold snap, right? So if we had just had a heat wave and we say, oh, it's almost 0 Celsius, then probably we mean that it's 1 positive, right? But if we're coming out of a cold snap, then saying it's almost 0 Celsius now means we're at -1, right? So what this means is that in these examples, the meaning of almost remains the same, right? So in both cases, what we have is an interaction between the polar implication and the closeness implication, but the meaning of almost exploits the direction of the scale that is introduced by the context. And while numerical values, so for example, for temperatures, they're compatible with both ascending and descending orders, right? So like in this example, a temporal scale is unidirectional. So in some cases, we will only have an interpretation by the nature of the scale that is invoked. So in our 2010 paper, we proposed an analysis that takes into account the fact that quasi, and the same is true for quasi in Portuguese or casi in Spanish, is a cross-categorial modifier which takes a focused constituent, alpha as argument, and yields the logical conjunction of two meaning components. The components I've mentioned before. So first, the negation of the proposition resulting from the application of the semantic value of alpha. So this is what I referred to before as the polar component. And a proposition that results from the application of a lower ranked alternative to the semantic value of alpha. And this is what I referred to before as the proximal component. And precisely because of the contribution of focus that I mentioned before, we're assuming that the semantic contribution of an expression alpha of some syntactic category that is focused on alpha is going to be an ordered pair that has two coordinates. The first coordinate is the semantic value alpha prime of alpha, and the second coordinate is a scale. So it's a set of alternatives to alpha prime, all of the semantic type, of the same semantic type as alpha prime, and ordered according to some linear relation, where this linear order is not part of the semantic contribution of focus, and it's contextually determined. So more specifically, in our analysis, we propose that that quasi takes two arguments. So the first argument that you see here is the F pair I just mentioned before, where here you have the semantic value of the focused constituent, and I'm using here this variable gamma. It's a variable over types because, as I mentioned before, quasi is cross-categorial, so it may modify pretty much every syntactic category. And the second coordinate is a scale, so it's a set of alternatives to the semantic value of the focused constituent. And then the second argument it takes is the semantic value of the part of the sentence which is not in focus. And the result of this is the two components I mentioned before. The first component is what I call the polar component. So it's the negation of the sentence for the value of the focus constituent. And then the second component is the proximal one, right? So what quasi asserts is that there is an alternative on the scale, right, which is ranked below the value of the focus constituent, and which is close to it, and the sentence is true for this alternative. Okay. So in the example before, this would be not 3 p.m., right? So the example, Joana chegou quase às 3. This would be she did not arrive at 3. And there is a time, right? There's an alternative which is close to 3, which is ranked below 3 and close to 3, and she arrived at this time. Okay, so in the work on approximatives, it has been noted that the polar component is backgrounded. And what this means is that it is somehow not asserted in the same way that the proximal component is. So Horn, 2002, used the term assertorically inert. So the claim is that while the proximal component is at issue, so it's basically what the speaker wants to contribute to the meaning of the sentence, the polar component is not at issue. It's there, but it doesn't really contribute to context update. And one test for this has been proposed by no one with evaluative adverbs. So in A, fortunately, almost all my friends attended my wedding. As no one notes, what is evaluated as fortunate is the fact that pretty much all my friends were present in my wedding. So not the fact that not all my friends attended, right? Which would be the meaning of the polar component, right? And so in this respect, evaluative adverbs provide a test for this assertoric inertia of the polar component. The meaning of A is quite different from B, right? Fortunately, not quite all my friends attended my wedding. So here the speaker seems to be considering fortunate that not all the friends attended. Another diagnostic for this different behavior between the two components is NPI licensing, right? So if you have a negative polarity item in a sentence with almost, the sentence is not good, as we have in 23, so I cannot say she almost budged or she almost slept a wink, despite the fact that almost in its meaning has a negative implication, right? So this has made some, like no one, conclude that the polar component is in some sense not part of what is being asserted, although it's part of the conventional meaning of almost. And in some of my work, I took this to an experimental study in which I was interested in seeing whether there's actually psycholinguistic evidence that speakers recognize these two components. And so in my study, I included a truth value judgment task and an acceptability rating task. So in the truth value judgment task, I was basically asking people, you have the sentence with almost, for example, John can almost swim, John can swim, or John cannot swim. Is this true or false, right? And in this study, it was found that native speakers actually acknowledge both polar and proximal components. So in one of the experiments, like I was saying, I tested the interpretation of the sentence in isolation because I was just interested in the truth conditions. Whereas in the other experiment, I looked at the sentence in context, and I was interested in the acceptability with different continuations, looking at context update. So to focus on the second task, so the assumption here is that if asserted content is the speaker's contribution to context update, then the preferred continuation is predicted to be the one that builds on asserted material. So this should be, according to Horn's account and others, this should be the proximal component. So here you have a table with the conditions in this experiment. I looked at almost and barely, like I said at the beginning. So this is one of the cases in which I was looking at both types of approximative adverbs. And so the crucial point about these conditions is that this continuation, therefore he'll enjoy a day at the pool with his friend, should target the proximal component, so the closeness to being able to swim, whereas this other continuation targets the polar component, he cannot swim, right? And then, of course, with barely the same thing. So if he can swim, which would be the polar component, he'll enjoy a day at the pool with his friends. And if he cannot swim in a satisfactory manner, then he's afraid of drowning. This would be the proximal component. And what I found is that in this second task, the acceptability rating task, subjects relied on the proximal component for judgments of possible continuations. So in terms of textual coherence, they seem to rely just on the proximal component. And you can see this in the figure. So the gray bars show the ratings coherent with the proximal component. And these ones, the white ones with little dots, the ones coherent with the polar component. So there's an effective adverb and type of continuation. And the size of the effect was actually bigger for barely than for almost. Something I can talk about later in the question session if you want. So the results of this experiment support an approach according to which the proximal component is asserted in the sense that it updates the common ground, while the polar component is entailed because obviously native speakers still recognized it in the question about the truth value of the sentence, but it's assertorically inert because they seem to not take it into consideration when they're judging the possible continuations. So we've seen that both the polar and the proximal component are conventional implications of approximatives. They're part of their lexical semantics. But while the proximal component remains invariable, the polar component does not. So what do I mean by this? So we've seen some cases in which it seems to really not matter for interpretation, as the cases that I just mentioned before. It doesn't really matter for for textual coherence. And then under particular contextual conditions, the polar component may either disappear, or in some cases, it seems to allow for ambiguity. So we're not really sure if it's there or not. So this sensitivity to context, I will argue, always involves speakers' expectations regarding the value of the modified element on a particular scale. So it involves expectations about the focused constituent and that value on a scale. So I will talk about two particular contexts in which the behavior of approximatives is interesting precisely because it has to do with the two components not acting as it would be predicted, particularly the polar one. And these two types of contexts are modification of comparatives and so-called inverted readings that I'll explain in a second. So starting with the case of comparatives. So here we're looking at sentences in which we're looking at Italian again, which quasi modifies a comparative of superiority of an adjective, okay? So we're going to see several naturally occurring examples of this. So in this first example, I'm going to start by reading it. Il fratello del mio ragazzo, che è 2 anni più giovane di lui, è quasi più alto di lui, e forse mezzo centimetro più basso. Okay, so my boyfriend's brother, who's 2 years younger than him, is almost taller than him. He's maybe half a centimeter shorter. And then the speaker goes on saying that Johnny really doesn't like this because his brother will soon be taller, and then he's going to be criticized by these friends and so on. His brother is growing taller than him, right? Sta per diventare più alto di lui, okay? So we're interested in what it means here to use quasi as a modifier of this comparative of superiority. And the good thing about this example is that we actually know from the context what is the reality, right? So in this case, the brother is maybe half a centimeter less tall, right? So in a scale, if we put this on a scale of height, we see that the younger brother's degree of height is actually just a little bit less than Johnny's, right, who's the boyfriend. So the interpretation intended here is a bit less tall, right? And if we go back to the proximal component that I presented before, when quasi modifies the comparative morpheme più, we can talk about several scalar alternatives to this value, right? So we would have as much as, a bit less, right? So in this case, all of these would be possible alternatives, right, to this to the focused element. And in this particular case, from the context, we see that in fact the alternative that makes the sentence true is a bit less, right? So that's the intended interpretation. So this is a little bit puzzling, right? Because in fact, the speaker could have used as much as, right? So the speaker could have said, il suo fratello è quasi alto quanto lui. He's almost as tall as him, right? Because this would be a bit less, would be the closest alternative actually to the value which will be as much as the equative, right? So why does the speaker choose the comparative of superiority? So, right, so why not choose the modified equative if a bit less is the semantic alternative that corresponds to the intended interpretation? So let's look at an example. Let's imagine that I show you this image and I ask you to describe the height of the little girl on the left, the girl in the blue dress, right? I think if I give you this out of the blue, you've never seen this before, the most likely description of this image would be that the girl in the blue dress is almost as tall as the girl in the white shirt, right? So you would use almost with an equative, right? But you would not use quasi with comparative of superiority, right? So why is this the case? Well, in examples in which we find almost modifying Pew, right? So these are examples in which the degree to which A has property P is higher than expected. So these are cases in which the closeness to the degree to which B is P is too close for comfort. So there's something about the unmodified comparative with the comparatives of superiority that expresses a relation which is unexpected, right? So under normal circumstances, one would expect that the converse relation would hold between A and B. So in our example, you would expect the older brother to be taller than the younger brother. And so what we see is that even if in terms of truth conditions, they could be used. I mean, the example before, we saw that quasi Pew, of course, allowed for both as much as and a bit less. The cases in which people use quasi Pew are actually a subset of the contexts of quasi with an equative, okay? And there's something special about them, or pragmatically constrained, that has to do with this idea that the unmodified relation is unexpected. This is an example that I found. It's an example in French, in which, again, you have presque, so the correspondent adverb to almost, with a comparative of superiority. So this is a text about cold and driving, right? So it says sécurité routière, le rhume presque plus dangereux que l'alcool au volant. So it asks, in road security, is the cold almost more dangerous than alcohol at the wheel? So looking at the analysis we have proposed before, this sentence means that the cold is not more dangerous than being intoxicated while driving, right? So this would be the polar component. And the cold is close to more dangerous than being intoxicated, right? So we would have a degree of closeness which could be as dangerous as, a bit less dangerous than, and so on, right? When we look at the actual text of these of this news, it's quite interesting that, in fact, the whole article is claiming that while one would think that the cold and the flu would be totally harmless for driving, in fact, as we see here, the effects of cold and the flu seem to be clearly more important than a positive alcohol level while you're driving, right? And so then the text goes on explaining in which ways. So, for example, your reaction time seems to be longer than if you're intoxicated and people don't respect the distances and so on. And then later, the article also talks about what happens when you sneeze, that you'll lose vision for some time period. So what's interesting in this example is that, in fact, the whole text is suggesting that having the flu is more dangerous for driving than being intoxicated, which means that there is no polar component in this example. So the intended meaning here is actually that the cold is more dangerous. And again, what we find here is that we have the reverse of an expected relation, right? So in general, because of all the importance that is placed on alcohol, the dangers of alcohol while driving, one would expect that being intoxicated is more dangerous than having a cold or anything else, right? So another example here of an interesting interpretation obtained with in this case, with casi in Spanish, comes from an example with before, with antes, and I'll explain in a second why I'm mentioning this within the case of comparatives. So this was found in an online review of a shopping experience, right? The person says, "Más lindo que en las fotos, llego casi antes de terminar el pedido, más que perfecto," right? So what the person means, of course, the product did not arrive before the order was completed, right? So we have the polar component. It arrived at a time which is close to when the order was completed. So we do have also the proximal component. The meaning here is that the product arrived shortly after it was ordered. But just like in the example of the two brothers in their height, the speaker could have chosen casi cuando terminé el pedido, right? So since the intended meaning is shortly after, there is no reason to pick antes, to pick before, as the modified element. So I'm mentioning here before within comparatives because it has actually been proposed that in several languages, the meaning of antes is a comparative. So semantically, antes is something like earlier than, because this explains a lot of its behavior cross-linguistically. And what's interesting is that with modification by almost and its cross-linguistic counterparts, we see precisely the same effect as we saw before with comparatives, right? So here again, the product arrived just a bit later than the time at which it was bought, but it arrived earlier than expected. And this is, again, the common element that we saw with the cases of comparatives. So if we think about this in terms of a scale of earliness, and remember, because this is earliness, it's the opposite of the temporal scale, right? So the idea is that typically we expect certain things to go in a certain order, right? So you find a product online, you order it, you receive it, right? And this is expected to occur in a certain order and to have a certain time between each of these steps, right? So in the particular case that's relevant for this example, you have the relation between ordering something and receiving it, right? And in this case, the receiving was earlier than expected, right? So the typical the typical duration or length of this process should be longer. Finally, the second type of context in which we find some interesting behavior in the interpretation of approximatives is the so-called inverted readings, a term that was coined by Schwenter 2002, looking at Spanish. Right, so one of the examples he gives is the one in 30. So you have a speaker opens a bag of cookies 2 days after having bought them and sees that there are just a few left. Looking at her spouse, she says, "Casi quedan." So in this case, if we think about the polar component of quasi, right, or quasi, as we saw before, this should mean that none remain, right? But what we see from the context is that, in fact, there are a few left, right? So if we had the sentence casi no quedan, right, with negation here, this would entail that there are some cookies left, right, by double negation. And then we are close to no cookies remaining, right? So the relevant alternatives would be to no, would be to none, would be few, very few, and so on by the proximal component. But in this case, what we see is that the sentence uttered means that no cookies remain, which is not what we know from the context, right? So here it looks like the polar component evaporates, right? In this very specific case, that if we think about the comparatives that I just mentioned before, what we see is that in this context, fewer cookies remain than expected, given when the cookies were bought, right? So again, assuming the scale of earliness that we saw also with the case of before, these interpretations arise when the speaker assumes a high degree of earliness in a contextually determined subscale for an event in question, right? So here, if you think about how early you finish eating cookies or you run out of cookies that you've eaten and bought, what we have here is a very close distance between buying cookies and finishing them. Okay, so an interim summary here about approximative adverbs. We've seen first that in the literature, it has been pointed out that the polar component is backgrounded or assertorically inert, but we've also seen contexts in which it can evaporate, actually. It seems not to be there when we look at the intended interpretation. And we see that it is sensitive to expectations or contextual assumptions about the modified value on the scale that's evoked by quasi, right? And in these types of examples we've seen of inverted and pragmatically constrained readings, they arise when the actual state of affairs involves a relation that is unexpected, right? So even in the cases in which the polar component did survive, right? Like the example of height, in which it was true that the brother was actually not taller, the selection of more as the modified element has to do with the relation that is unexpected. In fact, the converse relation would be expected to hold. And across languages, it is known that the interpretation of approximatives, especially with respect to their polarity, depends on expectations that are associated with the modified constituent. So this has been shown in many languages unrelated to the Romance languages, for example, for Mandarin Chinese, chai diat. Okay, so this has been known for a while. The co-occurrence with may, which is the negation, crucially depends on what is expected and the type of predicate that chai diat associates with. So moving now to the second class of adverbs, adverbs of truth and persistence. So what do approximatives and these adverbs have in common? And in particular, what do their properties reveal about the context sensitivity of non-asserted meaning components? As we saw before, under some contextually constrained conditions, the interpretation of approximatives is sensitive to expectations, in particular, the expected outcome of a temporal sequence. In the case of adverbs that denote truth persistence and truth and persistence that I'll explain in a second, we'll see that the presupposed component pertains to expectations and beliefs that are also anchored in a sequence of time. So they also have to do with a linear order, just like with approximatives. So let's move to some examples about what I mean by adverbs of truth persistence first. So in European Portuguese, if I utter sentence 31 on a Friday, sempre vou ao cinema no domingo, okay? This sentence has a different reading from 32, vou sempre ao cinema ao domingo, Okay, so the second sentence has the interpretation of habitual action. I always go to the movies on Sunday. And since Lewis, this has been treated as universal quantification over situations, right? So it simply means that every situation which is on a Sunday is such that I go to the movies in this situation, right? But this is not the meaning of 31, in which in European Portuguese, crucially, sempre must occur pre-verbally, okay? So what does it mean? It means that I'm confirming my plan of going to the movies on Sunday, right? So if I tell you this on a Friday, the presence of sempre in this sentence means that there is a presupposed plan that has been shared with my interlocutor, and that was for some time cast into doubt, and now I'm confirming it. So crucially in this sentence, the present tense receives a future interpretation, so it means I will go. And no domingo refers to a particular Sunday, right? So this sentence has an episodic reading, not the generic reading of the sentence 32 we saw before, right? In which I'm talking about a habit, right? So this type of interpretation has also been attested, for example, for Mexican Spanish. Siempre sí voy al cine would be the corresponding to 34, right? So here I'm confirming the truth that I planned to go to the movie on a specific day and time. And the same is true for Italian, vado sempre al cinema questa domenica. So it means, again, an episodic reading. I confirm my plan of going to the movies on Sunday. So in order to show how this use of sempre imposes what we call this value of truth persistence, or TP value, it's easier to see it in a table like this. So let's say on a Monday, T1, A says to B, I'm going to the movies on Sunday, so that's my proposition P. On Wednesday, later in the week, I say I'm busy and probably can't take time off in the next weeks. So this raises the possibility that not P. And then later on Friday, I actually state that I'm going to the movies on Sunday, which confirms the truth or the persistence of my originally expressed proposition, right? So this would be what we call the plan-related context. So this would be truth persistence, but then in several of these languages, in the Romance languages, we have an adverb that does the opposite. This is what we call truth and persistence. So for example, if I say afinal vou ao teatro no domingo, the contribution of afinal means what? That the speaker had planned on going to someplace different from the theater, for example, the movies on Sunday. And this was shared with the hearer, right? So this information of the plan was previously shared with the hearer. And the proposition expressed by the sentence without a final, so what we call the prejacent, so I'm going to the theater on Sunday, is incompatible with the previous plan. This type of use of a final often happens in these contexts that we call plan related. And the plan doesn't always have to be the plan of a single individual. So the initial example I've shown you actually is not an individual plan, right? So we can say that there are conditions on this use of a final. Condition one is some relevant agent had planned that the 2016 Olympics would be held in Rio de Janeiro. And a second condition, that information had been shared with the interlocutors of the sentence prior to this utterance. There is a second type of context in which there is no plan, but rather we're talking about a certain belief in a change in beliefs. So for example, in Portuguese, I can say this, afinal o Misha não é russo, é ucraniano, okay? So by adding a final to this sentence, what I mean is that the speaker had the belief that a certain proposition P star, that in this case that Misha is Russian, was true. So in the past, the speaker believed that Misha was Russian and had shared this belief with the hearer. But now is asserting that this is actually not true. So there is an epistemic change from the part of the speaker, from believing that Misha is Russian to believing that he's not Russian. So sentences with a finale, whether they're plan related or not, they have these two components, epistemic change. So they introduce a change in what the agent believes to be true, and also presuppositionality. So the use of a finale cannot occur out of a context because it's presuppositional. It requires a commitment to a previously entertained proposition, right? So what this means is that we cannot utter a finale out of the blue in a situation in which a previous information has not been shared. And something with which we observe in these sentences is that there is an end requirement. So what do I mean by this? Imagine in 41, the sentence we just saw before, afinal o Misha não é russo, é ucraniano. Imagine that I continue by saying, oh, but to be sure, I'm not certain yet. Mas para ter a certeza, ainda lhe vou perguntar. Se calhar é da Geórgia. Maybe he's Georgian, I don't know. So this is infelicitous, actually, even if conditions 1 and 2 hold. Why? Because when you use a finale in a sentence, the pre-adjacent is treated as introducing an epistemic state seen as final with respect to the question under discussion, right? So if I'm discussing what is Misha's nationality, if I introduce this sentence with a finale, what I mean is that I'm more certain now. And this final point of the time interval does not allow for a future information update. So there's also here an evidential component which is not necessarily entailed and only arises in these cases with beliefs. But if I'm now saying that this is the final epistemic state, because most likely the information I have now is more certain, I can't really continue and then cast into doubt again whether the proposition is true or not. So this final epistemic state coincides with the most certain information. So in our account of a finale and alla fine in Italian, we propose that in order to explain their meaning, we need to take into account the epistemic state of the interlocutors in context C at a certain time. So omega, capital omega here means it's a function that gives an epistemic state. So basically what the interlocutors of a certain context and in a time point believe to be true. So the proposition P star would be a part of this epistemic state. And then we have a set of time points that are ordered. So T star from T star to T sub end, ordered on the timeline from earlier to later, introducing a similar order on the corresponding epistemic states. And then we have a time interval, so from T star to T sub end, that corresponds to a discourse sequence relevant for the interpretation of the sentence. So this is not any set of time points, but only the ones that correspond to the moment at which I had a certain belief or I share that belief up to the point at which I receive information to the effect that not P, right? And then two propositions that I'm calling P star and the pre-adjacent, not P star, where this one is incompatible with the previous one. And by incompatible, we mean factually incompatible, not necessarily logically incompatible. Okay, so going back to the claim that a finale is presuppositional, it's important to mention that the notion of presupposition that's relevant here is not the classic one, right? So when we talk, for example, of presuppositions of a definite description, we say that we know that they can occur in the consequent of a conditional and hence be satisfied locally, right? By adding the content of the if clause to the common ground. So in 42, if I say, if John and Mary had an argument last night, their argument was heard by the neighbors, that's totally fine because the presupposition of there, right, is satisfied locally in the if clause, right, that there was an argument between John and Mary. On the other hand, this is not true for a finale and alla fine. So in 43, even if I'm introducing the presupposition in the if clause, se Gianni e Maria hanno discusso su dove andare. I cannot use alla fine here felicitously because the presupposition that I'm talking about is actually about shared common ground between the interlocutors. And something that is interesting is that although there is this requirement on a previously shared proposition, it's also possible to have presupposition accommodation. So the example you have in 44 is an example that we found in a newspaper talking about a movie with Scarlett Johansson. And this appears in the title, Innamorarsi di una voce, specie se quella di Scarlett Johansson, non è alla fine una cosa rara. So to fall in love with a voice, especially if the voice is that of Scarlett Johansson, is not alla fine a rare event, okay? So it's clear that in this case, the writer of the article has not been talking to the reader about this, right? So this appears as a title. But the felicity of the sentence relies on the possibility of accommodating this presupposition that falling in love with a voice is rare, right? So in this case, this proposition is treated as shared knowledge and can be accommodated for this reason. Of course, although it has not been previously uttered at a time before the time at which this sentence is produced. One more point that has to do with this presupposed component of adverbs of truth and persistence is that there are some contexts that are slightly different from the ones I've presented. So imagine 45, alla fine quest'estate andiamo al mare, okay? Alla fine this summer we will go to the seaside. So if this sentence is uttered in a context in which people have been discussing where to go on vacation in the summer, the sentence can actually be produced even if it was never believed that the incompatible, the opposite proposition would be true, right? So even if there wasn't, let's say, a strict plan to not go to the seaside in the summer, okay? So there are actually several contexts, both in it for Italian and for Portuguese, in which you can utter these adverbs without having this incompatible proposition having been uttered or shared in the background. And these are cases in which there are several options that have been considered, right? And so we can think about the question, the QED that I have here. I mean, according to some semantic accounts of questions, for example, Grandijk and Stockhoff, questions are disjunctions of mutually exclusive alternatives, right? So in this case, what we have is a change from an epistemic state where multiple alternatives are entertained, right? So several alternatives are under consideration. For example, that we go to Rome, that we go to the mountains, that we go to the seaside, so they are seen as possible, to a final point that is T-end, the end of the temporal sequence, at which it is decided that we go to the seaside, and for this reason, then this proposition is negated, right? So it seems that we don't actually need the proposition with the opposite polarity, but in fact, that the possibility of this proposition is raised. So with adverbs of truth and persistent, we've seen that the relevant component and the one that places constraints on their use is this need for a change in what the speaker and the interlocutors believe to be true on the basis of information obtained, previously assumed plan or general knowledge. And as in the case of approximatives, the semantic representation of these adverbs involves a linear order, which here is a linear order of times and corresponding epistemic states. And this presupposition of truth persistence or unpersistence places constraints on when these adverbs can be felicitously used. So going back to our initial question, what do approximatives and adverbs of truth and persistence have in common? Well, we've seen first that the polar component of approximatives is encoded but not at issue, and these adverbs have pragmatically constrained uses because they're sensitive to expectations about the scalar value denoted by the focused constituent. In the case of the presupposition of truth and persistence, it's also encoded but not asserted, and it relies on a previously entertained commitment to the truth of a proposition. So in both cases, their meaning involves expectations about sequences of events, albeit in different ways. In the first case, these expectations affect the polar component and provide constraints on the use of the adverb. Whereas in the case of adverbs of truth and persistence, they have to do with this presupposed proposition that can be a previous plan or belief. In both cases, the expectations have to do with the not at issue component. And like we said, their semantic representation involves a scale, right? So I argue that this contextual sensitivity in both cases has to do with speakers' expectations associated with values on that scale. And we've seen that in their lexical representation, we're assuming that a linear order or a scale is part of their lexical meaning. In addition, these two classes of adverbs participate in a morphosyntactic alternation in which one form is more restricted than another in terms of combinatorial possibilities. So for approximatives, at least in some of the Romance languages, we have either another adverbial or a verbal periphrasis that has a similar meaning but is more restricted. It only has a counterfactual meaning and must combine with events. So in European Portuguese, for example, you have por pouco, and the same is true for Spanish, por poco, as well as a verbal periphrasis formed by the verb ir, to go, in the imperfective with a gerund. So this periphrasis also has a meaning of closeness and a negative polarity component, a polar component of a negation of a proposition, but it always yields a counterfactual meaning. So it can only combine with events. Unlike the less restricted adverb, which is a cross-categorial adverb like we've seen before, quasi and casi in Spanish. For adverbs of truth and persistence, likewise, you have a periphrasis that, so in Portuguese it's acabar por, in Italian finire per, that can only be used to express a change in expectations about events, but not beliefs. While a finale and alla fine, as we have just seen, may express both. So here are some examples for the approximatives. So in European Portuguese, you can say o João quase caiu, o jogador quase caiu, ou é quase loiro. So both with an inventive predicate and a stative predicate. It's totally fine. And we've seen, of course, with many other types of syntactic categories. With por pouco, it must combine with an inventive predicate. And the same with the periphrasis formed by ir plus the gerund. O jogador ia caindo is fine, but o jogador ia sendo loiro is not acceptable unless we can come up with some situation in which he almost became blonde because something happened to his hair, like someone threw a dye on his hair or something. But that's really trying to create a change of state interpretation. And for adverbs of truth and persistence, as we can see here, so a finale can be used for a change in beliefs. So this is an epistemic change in beliefs from believing that he was Russian, that he was not Russian to believing he's Russian. This is not possible with the periphrasis. Okay, so the periphrasis can only be used for plan-related propositions, so cases in which we have a change that has to do with a sequence of events. So this difference between a finale and alla fine and the periphrasis formed by and by V2 is quite interesting because it shows different types of epistemic change in time, right? Some only involve expectations about a sequence of events, versus epistemic changes that consist of a change in beliefs, right? So in European Portuguese and Italian, the verbal periphrases with the verb to end can only be used with sequences of events. So the sequence of epistemic states requires an expectation about the outcome of a sequence of events. On the other hand, both afinal and alla fine can be used to express beliefs about a certain state holding at present and about expectations concerning outcomes of sequences of events. So to conclude in this talk, I've focused on the polar component of approximative quasi and the presupposition of a final, an adverb of truth and persistence, and their interaction with contextual information. I have claimed that the interpretation of approximative adverbs is sensitive to expectations about a scalar value, which is the limit point denoted by the semantic value of the focused constituent. While for adverbs of truth and persistence, the presuppositional component pertains to a temporal succession of epistemic states, where these may or may not be associated with temporal sequences of events. But in both cases, the not at issue component of meaning keeps track of what the interlocutors know, believe, or expect to happen. And I've claimed that they share several commonalities that justify considering them together. We saw that the two meaning components have different theoretical status. Their implications, they both involve implications about propositions with opposite polarity, and they relate to expectations about sequences of events. And I believe that this cluster of meanings and constraints relates to their lexical core, particularly the fact that both involve a linear order or scale in their lexical semantics. So I believe that by comparing not at issue meanings across classes of adverbs, we can better understand the complex interaction between lexical meaning and context sensitivity, especially by considering how this contextual dependence really can be at the core of their semantic representation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Patrícia, for that very interesting talk. At this point, we'll begin the Q&A. And I'm going to go ahead and ask the first question since I don't see any questions in the chat yet. But please do feel free to comment there if you have questions or comments for Patrícia. And this question is actually related to something that you mentioned earlier when you presented the figure with the experimental results. And you talked about how there's a larger effect for barely than there is for almost. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so the both for almost and for barely, the results were significant, statistically significant, but the size of the effect was greater for barely. And the interpretation that I gave in that paper was that the presence of negation in the meaning of barely, the idea of insufficiency or a very low degree of a property might be associated with that. We also know that cross languages, I mean, for example, with hardly, we have consistently cases of switch of polarity. So sometimes people interpret hardly as no, right? While in other cases, you have an interpretation in which the entailment is a positive one, so the proposition is entailed. So there seems to be more polarized judgments with respect to these adverbs that have this negation component in their proximal component. And so I don't have a good explanation for that. It's more like an observation that my experimental results confirmed. But if we think that in those adverbs like barely and hardly, the negation is part of the proximal component, and since this is the one that is asserted, it makes sense, I think, that it's the one that's more important for the purposes of coherence and acceptable continuations.
Sure. Okay. I don't see any other questions in the chat just yet. I do have another question for you, though, if I could be so bold, about the Italian data. So you had the example talking about sempre vo, sempre si voi, and then you had Italian. And one thing that struck me is that you mentioned for European Portuguese, you have this option of placement for sempre that gives you the different interpretations. Whereas it looks like for Italian, since you don't really have this possible use of preverbal sempre, it maybe is the other lexical material like the questa domenica that can disambiguate between the two readings. Is that on the right track?
Yes, so in Italian, you don't have this restriction on the preverbal position. So it seems to be the case for European Portuguese that many of these adverbs, I mean, the same thing happens with mal, for example. So when mal is post-verbal, it's always a manner adverb. And if it's pre-verbal, it's an approximative. So there are actually syntactic studies on Portuguese proposing a position for these adverbs. And the same is true for sempre. So there's actually a syntactic analysis of sempre, it's called confirmative sempre in those studies. So that will be our sempre of truth persistence. Whereas for Italian, you don't have this restriction on position. And in fact, some sentences could be ambiguous. The only way you distinguish between the always and the truth persistence interpretation is by the context, or like you said, by the difference in the temporal expression, whereas it's questa domenica, so you get an episodic interpretation versus la domenica, so every Sunday. Yeah, so that's definitely the case. And I think when we were working on it, we found some examples that could allow for both readings. So yeah, so that would definitely be true for Italian.
Okay. All right. Don't see any other questions just yet. I do have another question about Spanish, but maybe I'll wait a second here and see if anybody wants to chime in. All right, well, I'll just go ahead then. So I was wondering about the use of terminar and the progressive in Spanish, and how that might line up with the al final, a la fine examples. So is it of that class, or is it more of the acabar por class that is limited to counter expectation? Do you have a sense of where it falls in terms of those two?
I haven't worked on that yet. So there is some work on Spanish from Garcia Fernandez and others looking at these preferences. And some of the studies I found, they say that these periphrases son perífrasis discursivas. So trying, I think, to account precisely for the constraints on use that I was mentioning. I haven't looked at them or tried to compare their uses with the Portuguese ones. But definitely, I think it's very similar in the sense that you also have like the resulta que, right? That also has to do with this epistemic change. So I think there are actually several ones, right? Not just one periphrasis, but several ones. And there may be, I think, a difference also between the ones that express just a change in belief from a change in expectations about events. So something that's like a plan, for example, which I think would be the case with terminar, right? So I don't think you could use it for a change in belief. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I wasn't sure myself, but my sense is that it's a little bit more like the ones that require it to be a change in
events. Yeah, in a sequence of events. I think so. But that would be a hypothesis to see. So in our last paper, we have a pretty large section trying to explain why we think these two types of epistemic change exist. I mean, it seems that languages are sensitive to this distinction, at least because you have expressions that only encode one type of change, right? And so that would be really interesting to see if, for example, if in Spanish you have one periphrasis that's just used for one type of change and the other for the other, yeah.
Mhm. Great. Well, I think I'll, at this point, thank you.
The rest of it.
Pardon?
We can just chat, the two of us.
So I think I'll thank you once again, Patricia, on behalf of Abralin, for this talk and for your insights here in the Q&A as well. And I'd also like to invite our audience members to continue watching the series in the future. There are several talks upcoming. And with that, I'll give you the floor, Patricia, to offer some final remarks and close out the session for us if you'd like.
Yeah, so I just wanted to thank again Abralin for the invitation, and thank you for attending, Mark, and for taking the time to do this. And also to thank the audience. And of course, and my email is pretty easy to find. So if you have questions or comments or suggestions, I'll be very happy to hear from you.
Thank you.